Okay, hi everyone. I guess we'll get started. I am Leah Douglas. I'm a reporter and editor with the Food and Environment Reporting Network, where we cover all issues related to environment, agriculture, food production, labor, and on and on. I'm really excited for this panel. We've got a really awesome lineup of papers and speakers. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much to the folks from the project for inviting me, and everyone who's helping with tech support. It's going so smoothly, so really appreciate that. So just a couple minutes to sort of situate us on this panel. So far this morning, we've heard a lot about kind of the big structural concerns facing the meat industry in particular, looking at how consolidation has really centered corporate power and created a system in which there's very few options for all players involved. In this panel, the three papers are looking specifically at the impacts of all that consolidation and the structural issues on farmers and workers. And some themes that I sort of pulled out when I was reading through the papers was calls for more democracy in the system, more fairness and equity in our food markets, and some alternative ways of thinking about how we could structure the industrialized food system to give all players and all actors some more agency. And of course that intersects with all the policy issues we've been discussing and the antitrust law issues we've been discussing. And what a ripe time, as Chris Leonard really pointed out in his opening remarks, and Austin spoke about as well, to be talking about these issues. I mean, we know that the pandemic has really spotlighted how brittle the food system is. That's a word a few people have used in their papers that I find really evocative. We've seen just so much fracturing in the way that our food is produced and gets to market, and the really difficult and heartbreaking effects of that on our labor, food system labor in particular, which is an issue that I've been covering in detail this year as the pandemic has gone on. So, as we'll hear from our speakers, a lot of the brittleness in the system can be attributed to this consolidation we've talked about, and how little flexibility there is in the system that's really arranged around economic efficiency. So to get us talking about this, we'll have our first presenter, Candice Yandam Riviere. I really apologize if I mispronounce any of that, my accent, and who is a JD candidate at the University of Chicago Law School and a PhD candidate in economics at Pantheon Sorbonne University, who will be talking about her paper on monopsony and H2A workers, a really fascinating topic. I'll introduce the rest of the speakers as we go along so that folks get a refresher right before seeing your faces. Before Candice starts, just reminding everyone again that if you have a question, feel free to chat it to me using the chat feature. I'll read it during the Q&A, or and that the chat is in the bottom of your screen. And please remember to keep yourself muted unless you're asked to unmute. So great, every speaker will have about 5 to 7 minutes, and take it away, Candice.
I think you can you see the slides? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the Thurman Arnold Project and all the organizers at Yale for organizing this great conference. I'm very grateful to be able to share my research and get your feedback. So thank you. So today I'm going to talk about the labor market monopsony problem in agriculture, which is, a question that combines different areas of law and also economics. So immigration law, antitrust law, and economics. So I only have a few minutes. I will, briefly touched upon the main ideas and some of the empirical results, but I'm eager to hear your questions and happy to kind of dig deeper into any specific points that you might be interested in. I want to convey two main points. The first one is that our current legal framework in immigration law for hiring temporary migrant workers, or I will also call them H2A workers, because that's the name of the visa that they, that they apply for when they come into work in the US, exacerbates labor market monopsony in the agriculture sector. So essentially what a monopsony is, just briefly, for those who may not be familiar with the concepts, is that there's a single firm or an industry or an employer that dominates the market and that, you know, acts on the demand of labor, and can do things such as, you know, setting wages below competitive level, or but at the same time kind of still benefit from a steady labor supply. The second point that I want to make is kind of show you, you know, that empirically there are identifiable consequences to a more concentrated labor market in the agriculture sector, and negative effects on, you know, not just domestic workers or US workers that can't access certain jobs, but also on migrant workers. So the problem is not immigration and migrant workers, the problem is the framework that essentially harms workers in general. So let's turn to the law first, and we'll talk about economics after. The immigration law framework exacerbates labor market power, I think, through three main channels. The first one is the statute. The way that the statute is written and the way that it is administered leads to anti-competitive conduct and market concentration. The second channel is that courts, the way that courts read and interpret the statute, they kind of interpret the statute as carving out an exception to antitrust law, which is a very big problem, because then, you know, plaintiffs can't use antitrust law to challenge some of the conduct that these employers have. And the third channel is that there is a lack of labor mobility that's due to the constraint of contractual work, which, you know, exacerbates also labor market monopsony and labor market power. So the immigration statute, the first prong of the statute says that in order to import migrant workforce under the H-2A programs, farmers and ranchers have to show that they suffer from a labor shortage. But that doesn't make much sense, right? Because the first expected response intuitively to a shortage is that wages will increase, but that's not what happened. Instead, employers fix wages or set wages below US workers' reservation wage, below the competitive wage, which leads to this sort of made up labor shortage. So they essentially create a labor shortage by pushing out US workers from applying for those jobs by setting the wage quite low. And so through this anti-competitive conduct, they're able to trigger the statute, and it's very unclear how they would be able to trigger it otherwise because of this labor shortage kind of prong that doesn't really make much sense. The other problem, which I think is a very important one, is that Congress explicitly permitted agricultural associations to make collective decisions about hiring migrant labor, which include, you know, decisions about setting their wages, about some of the working conditions. And so these associations are essentially able to hire workers on behalf of their members, and then they can, you know, kind of dispatch those workers among the different farms and different ranches. And they can, you know, they are sometimes responsible for recruiting about 90% of the workers in a specific market, which gives them, you know, tremendous labor market power. The court's interpretation is also problematic, as I've mentioned. You know, courts have essentially been carving out an exception for associations from antitrust law. There are very few cases that kind of dig into these concepts, but in Yakua, the case that I've put up in the slides, kind of shows a little bit the struggles that the court has with, you know, kind of looking at the statute and at the same time realizing that the statute may cause some antitrust problem, but kind of choosing that the statute will prevail anyway. And so in the end, holding that, you know, the regulation allows associations to act as employer, but the fact that they share information is not sufficient evidence just to support conspiracy, just because the statute allows it. And then, of course, courts have also barred plaintiff from challenging the recruitment of migrant workers based on the fact that U.S. workers are available to work at a higher wage. So, that's also a very problematic issue. There is the last legal kind of point that I wanted to make is in the legal framework is the lack of labor mobility. And I think that's just very inherent to guest worker visa programs in general, but specifically in the H-2A programs, workers can't switch jobs if they're unhappy with their wages or unhappy with the working conditions. They're very much tied to their employers or to the association that has employed them. And so they can't really, they can't really switch jobs, which in turn does not give any incentive for other firms to offer better wages or better working conditions. And that in turn, exacerbate this kind of monopsony problem. In terms of empirical evidence, and this is, I didn't want to burden everyone with numbers, but essentially the two main results that I find are, in line with the literature also, is showing that I find that higher levels of labor market concentration, so, fewer employers on the market or fewer associations, is associated with lower wages for H-2A workers, and that these results are robust to, including kind of a wide panel of fixed effects and controls. And I'm happy to talk more about the empirical specification if you'd like. And of course, the effects are larger in the shepherding industry. It's a very concentrated industry, and the Yakua case that I mentioned earlier is about shepherds as well. So it's not surprising. Some potential reforms, preventing associations from acting as employers, I think would be a great first step. Regulating that more would be a great first step. And so associations have tremendous labor market power, and that's just very problematic. Courts should also be able to consider associations' behavior when they look at, Section 1 Sherman Act claims. And finally, I think there should be some sort of labor mobility mechanism to allow migrant workers to switch jobs. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Candice. Fascinating, and can't wait to get into some discussion of that. So next up, we have a panel of three speakers. So we have Emily Miller, who's the Policy and Research Manager at Family Farm Action Alliance. We have Mary Hendrickson, who's the Associate Professor of Rural Sociology at the University of Missouri and co-director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security. And we have Phil Howard, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University, and they'll be speaking about their paper on power in the agri-food system.
Thanks so much, Leah. What a trip to be introduced by Leah Douglas, everyone. That's super cool. I am Emily Miller, and actually I'll just be presenting on the paper, but no worries, Dr. Hendrickson and Dr. Howard will be in the Q&A. So, but as mentioned, I'm the Policy and Research Manager at Family Farm Action Alliance. We're a national thought leader and policy developer for food and farm policy all across the supply chain. So we're thinking about independent farmers and ranchers, workers, eaters, and the environment. Our paper, the Missouri School, Examining Power in the Agri-Food System to Suggest Alternatives, and we do just that. So broadly, the agri-food system today is concentrated from local to global levels, and we believe that the root of this concentrated food system are unequal power relationships. So we use the Missouri School tradition of analyzing the structure and relationship in the food system, and from there recommend 6 key points of intervention to democratize the food system. So from that really sociological view, using the mode of power approach, from there, Family Farm Action Alliance was able to implement those 6 key points and turn it into a comprehensive toolkit that we just presented this week to the 117th Congress. So the challenge we all face, though, is that this can't all be done through policy. We can't democratize the entire food system just through policy. We need folks from all levels. That's why it's really exciting to be on this conference where we're talking with attorneys, journalists, advocates. So we're hoping that you can use this framework in your work as well. So quickly, I'll overview our broad findings from our analysis of concentration in the agri-food system. Then I'll go over those 6 key points of intervention used by Family Farm Action Alliance. And then we'll talk a little bit about how those can all be mobilized for everyone to use. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so can you all see some CR4 graphs? Yeah, right on. So very quickly, here are global market concentration CR4s. For those unfamiliar, the concentration ratio measures the top 4 firms' control of a sector. And here we're looking at the inputs, right? It's globally concentrated. They're multinational corporations that own that control the markets for the inputs. You'll see across these graphs that it's the same firms that are owning and controlling the different sectors. Generally, we're concerned over a level of a CR4 where it's 40%. So the top 4 firms control 40% of the market. On the other side, on the market side, we also see that soybean processing, beef processing, again, it's above that problematic level, much above that problematic level. And then if you look at the bottom 3 rows of CR4 graphs, that's the retail market. So that's what consumers are seeing in the grocery stores. It's the same firms that are controlling all of these markets. On the farm, what does this look like, right? We've already heard this morning, but if you look at these graphs, the blue bar is the number of farms, and that orange line, that's either the sales or inventory midpoint. And midpoint means that half of the sales are above that number and half of the sales are below. So it's easy to see that over time, the number of total farms has gone down, yet the sales and inventory has been rising. So great. For a lot of us, this isn't new information, but when we look at it from the Missouri school tradition, where we're looking at structure and power relationships, we can kind of look for alternatives and ways to go forward. So quickly, the Missouri school, it requires us to look at the current structure of the agri-food system through power relationships. We look at 2 different kinds. So we're looking at the political economy of the agri-food system, where we look at the relationships between corporations, the state, and the people. But we're also looking at a political ecology because inherently the agri-food system ties humans and the environment together. From there, we use what's called a mode of power analysis. This is Knudsen and Bichler. And they argue that economic and political power is so closely entwined that in fact it's inseparable. And so what that translates to at the agri-food system is that a handful of CEOs, largely those CEOs of these large food firms, are controlling who farms, what they farm, where it's farmed, and ultimately who gets to eat. So, but why would we want the agri-food system organized this way, this brittle, efficiency-ridden system? It's been argued that it feeds people. Well, in fact, we know that it does not even do that. In our paper, we look at 2 exemplars, one in meat packing and the other in Dicamba drift. But we also see, it's been reported on time and time again how milk is dumped, eggs are smashed, workers are in egregious working conditions, again, but it's also been pointed out that this isn't new in our agri-food system. So from our analysis, we were looking for points of intervention. We're looking at all those horrible things about power relationships, but we can also see some points of light. Where can we move forward? So apologies for the text, but this is important, so I'll read through it as well. These 6 key points of intervention are: 1, to curb monopolistic tendencies in the agri-food system; 2, shine a racial lens on scholarship in the agri-food system and consolidation; 3, to prioritize resilience and redundancy; 4, rethink the core assumptions such as efficiency and property rights; 5, encourage the development of alternative production and consumption arrangements. And 6, rethink what kinds of crops, livestock, and even sectors of the food system are subsidized in a way that allows citizens to truly weigh the benefits and consequences of how we subsidize things and arrange our agri-food system. So from those 6 key points, Family Farm Action Alliance then took those and said, what does that mean for the priorities we put out in the 116th Congress? This legislative table, it's also publicly available. You'll see that some bills our partner organization, Family Farm Action, filed and supported in the 116th Congress. And it's organized under these 6 key points of intervention. So we can really sort out, you know, where specifically are we trying to move forward? Where are we trying to intervene in this highly consolidated food system? So this is a snapshot of how we can utilize this framework. We also put together a comprehensive toolkit, a report rather, titled Ushering a Better Future for Food and Agriculture, where we organize priorities and policies that we developed and researched under those 6 key points of intervention. It addresses a broad swath of things that have been mentioned today, so I'd encourage you to take a look. Also with under each of those 6 priorities, we developed a 1-page toolkit that breaks down immediate congressional action, as well as advocacy and organizing priorities that can be used by folks on this call, organizations, if they so choose, where you can support existing legislation, emerge administrative action, and then also champion new legislation and action that hasn't really been done before. Lastly, I'll say, while we were looking specifically at the agri-food system, concentration is rampant and these harms are rampant across all sectors of our economy and our daily lives. So it's our hope that this framework can be adapted and used eventually by other sectors, because at its heart, it's really looking at democratizing all of these systems. So no longer just a few people control who gets to eat, essentially. So I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to our conversation in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. Can't wait to discuss that further in the Q&A as well. So in our third paper, we will hear about fairness perceptions and expectations in agriculture. Super fascinating. So we'll hear from Dr. Hendrickson again from the University of Missouri. Also, Harvey James, professor of agricultural and applied economics in the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and Christine Sanders, who is PhD candidate in the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri. So take it away.
Thank you very much. Very grateful to be here and to participate in this important conference. A lot of interesting things happening here. Just very grateful to be here. And I will talk about some of the research that Mary Hendrickson and Christine Sanders and I have been doing over the past couple years on fairness. A sustainable and equitable food system requires that people have a perception that the market is fair. And we've been hearing a lot about consolidation, monopoly power, and so forth in agricultural markets. And as these markets become more concentrated, so that there are fewer buyers of agricultural commodities, over time, there has been a growing chorus of concern that these markets are less fair. So that word fair has become quite prominent. And a good example of this is something we've heard earlier today, reference to the USDA and Department of Justice workshops in 2010, where farmers expressed considerable concerns about fairness, and I put a couple quotes up on the screen from those workshops. But unfairness is something that has been expressed, and so the question is, what do we do when somebody says that's not fair? How do we evaluate these claims? The problem with fairness or unfairness claims is that these kinds of claims can be very subjective. You know, what's fair for you is not fair for me. Buyers think low prices are fair. Sellers think high prices are fair. I think it's very, very difficult to deal with. And in previous efforts to evaluate fairness or unfairness in markets have typically started with some kind of a framework or theory, you know, such as antitrust legislation or some principle of procedural or distributed justice. And the problem with this approach is that when you pick a framework to evaluate or assess the claim of fairness, you're essentially picking a winner or a loser. And so Mary Hendrickson and I have spent some time working on this and for a couple of years, and we've developed a framework that avoids the subjective problem of evaluating unfairness claims by focusing on conditions of power and dependency, and by utilizing a framework that links fairness to expectations. Think about times in your life when you felt something has been unfair. Probably that is because you have some kind of an expectation, and that expectation has not been realized. In a previous session, I noticed that Bill Bullard put up a graph showing prices for beef and cattle going in opposite directions, and we look at that and we say that's not fair, especially if producers are these meat companies are charging high prices to consumers when their input prices are low. Why do we think that's unfair? Because we have an expectation that in a competitive environment, if firms have low input costs, those low prices should be translated into lower prices to consumers. And so when we think about fairness, we think we link that to expectations, and there are different types of things that affect our expectations. Two types of expectations, general types, are predictive and prescriptive. Predictive expectations are behaviors that we expect because they're typical within a particular context or relationship. So time consistency would be something, would be an example. If I've been treated a certain way over time, I will expect that treatment will continue in the future. Prescriptive expectations are beliefs about what we think should be. And there are various factors that affect this expectations. The important part of this framework is that it allows us to make an assessment of unfairness claims. If someone makes a claim of unfairness, then what we do is we examine the expectation and we ask ourselves, is the expectation reasonable? So for example, I have students at the end of the semester that will come to me and say, the grade you gave me is unfair. And I say, why? And they say, well, because I attended class all the time and I worked hard. And I say, well, show me in the syllabus where it said that working hard is going to be the standard by which you will be graded. And they can't, and so that expectation is not reasonable. So that's the idea where we link fairness to expectations. And so because fairness perceptions relate to expectations, it's important to understand how, where, and why these expectations form. And so we thought Dicamba would be an interesting context to examine expectations. Dicamba is controversial. So we started there. So 2 years ago, a year and a half or so ago, we did some exploratory interviews with farmers in Missouri. And we wanted to ask them what expectations they have about fair treatment, what affects their expectations, and if their concerns about Dicamba are justified. And just very briefly, many of you will probably be familiar with the problem with Dicamba. Dicamba as an herbicide was registered in the 1960s. It's available in over 1,000 products in the U.S. It has a long history in row crop production, but the production of Dicamba tolerant soybeans and cotton has extended the timing application. of dicamba, and so it has resulted in it can result in damage from herbicide drift to neighboring farms and homeowners, and it creates a lot of controversy. And so we interviewed farmers just to get the kind of sense of what their expectations are and how it links to fairness. So one organic vegetable grower in the 60s, interesting, was the only respondent out of the 10 who specifically mentioned unfairness. He said, "Why is it our responsibility to protect ourselves from them? Because their stuff is drifting over on us. It affects our ability to farm the way we want to." So, you know, some of that, to me, if you get right down to it, yeah, it's kind of unfair. From this quote, we can infer the farmer's expectations. The neighbors should buffer, fence, or otherwise protect farmers from drift, not interfere with their ability to farm. And we can also infer that this farmer perceived that those expectations were violated, and hence the claim of unfairness. Other farmers recognize that the problem at dicamba is moral, even if they did not specifically state that the problem was unfair. So one farmer said, "Morally, can you spray a product that you have no control over once it leaves the boom tip, and you have to rely on Mother Nature to keep it where it's at, and you damage someone else's crop?" From the farmer's perspective, you know, we recognize that not all moral and ethical problems are perceived in terms of fairness. But this also suggests that farmers can articulate expectations, perceive problems as problematic, even if they do not perceive that their expectations have been violated. This same respondent made an interesting comment. He said, "With dicamba, you can do everything right, and it can still move around and damage the neighbor's orchard or the garden or lady down the road." So here we can infer that the expectation is that the farmer should apply dicamba properly, but even if the chemical still causes harm, that doesn't necessarily mean that expectations have been violated. If a farmer applied the chemical correctly, and that's what we expect, and there's still harm, we can have a problem of harm, but that doesn't necessarily translate it into a claim of unfairness. And so this particular farmer expressed that idea. Some other examples of prescriptive expectations that we found in our interviews with farmers. Farmers and their input suppliers should and in fact do know how to correctly use and apply herbicides, and that the impacts of herbicide use can be controlled or limited to certain fields. Okay, this is an expectation that we observed. Farmers shouldn't have to plant defensively, that is, plant dicamba resistant crops in order to avoid problems of damage caused by neighbors' farmers' use of chemicals. Farm chemicals should not be approved unless they're researched and vetted independently, and government agencies should be more vigilant in disciplining bad actors. Sources of expectations, farmers identified various sources, but the two most important ones are making ethical decisions and knowing and being informed. In other words, farmers see dicamba use as an ethical problem. They want to do the right thing, but the volatile nature of dicamba makes that difficult. Also, farmers want to be informed about the risks and how to use the chemical correctly without harming themselves and others. So, the conclusion here, people make unfairness claims, and when they perceive their expectations have been violated. Most farmers we spoke with did not really express concerns about unfairness, even though they perceive the situation, the problem. Why? Maybe farmers did not have clear expectations about the dicamba, or felt that those expectations are violated. Maybe also the expectations that farmers had were not fully developed or fully formed in their mind. Maybe that's because their experience with dicamba in this way has been relatively new. We need more research in understanding farmer expectations in order to assess fairness in the marketplace. And this is important because we need to understand how expectations are formed, where and how they are violated, and so forth. And I think, and Mary and I think that an understanding of expectations, particularly as they relate to fairness, can lead to fairness being incorporated into competition and contract policy, especially if we can remove the problem of the subjective nature of fairness claim evaluation. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. So we've got about 20 minutes now for question and answer.